Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of APIs You Won't Hate, the podcast. It's the audio version instead of blog posts. We're here talking about APIs, and today I've got Joel Clermont with me, who is well known around the Laravel PHP community, but might be new to some of you folks. So, Joel, hello. What's going on?
Hello. Not too much. Yeah, I've listened to some of your episodes here, and I'm like, I am definitely not in the API dev tooling space. That is not my specialty. I'm coming at this more as the in the trenches practitioner, building, shipping, supporting APIs, and not like the higher level tooling person that's building
Yeah.
things for other people to use.
Well, that's fine. So we're not, we have, because I have been working in the kind of open API dev tooling space, a lot of the content ends up being quite specific to that. And that's not really what this podcast is
Sure.
meant to be. Like if you cast your mind back
Okay.
to way back when of the origins of of APIs You Won't Hate as anything before it was a community and a podcast, I was writing that book, Build APIs You Won't Hate, which was pretty much how to make REST-ish APIs in Laravel. And all of it was Laravel. So it's lovely to be chatting to Laravel people, and I still build APIs in Laravel. And I think it's important that we don't I don't want to kind of separate out that there's the API community and then like all of the programmers who are actually building APIs in various frameworks. It's all overlapping circles.
Okay.
And whenever I'm talking to people about
Yeah.
like one of the main things in API DevRel, I always try and explain to folks is that like if you go to API conferences and you only ever talk about APIs and you sell your products to other people who care about APIs, it's a very small world. But if you go to Laravel PHP meetups and things like that, then there's actual people who
Yeah.
might end up using your stuff who have never heard about any of the wonderful, lofty things you've been talking about and really should have. So that's kind of why I'm talking to you today you're posting
Okay.
about like how you like to make API specs with Laravel or how you don't. So you wrote an article called, I have it right here, Why I Don't Like Generating API Specs, which is pretty nail on the head. Do you want to tell me a
Sure.
little bit more
Yeah.
about this? And you said there's a series of blog posts and like what led to this. Tell me more.
Yeah, it actually started like I think so first of all, for a little context, I have a site called Mastering Laravel.io, and I publish, for some reason I committed to a daily newsletter Monday through Friday, and I cross post to the site. But so any random thought that pops into my head, I'm like, oh, that could make an email, right? So I'll write it down. And I was working on a project recently, building an API for a Laravel company, and we were writing the spec, and the client, like, they're an existing product, and they're like, we've never written a spec, like we only have an internal team. And so that kind of started the discussion, which is like, I think it's useful, in fact I know it's useful to have a spec, even if you don't have a giant team, even if you don't have like a separate front end and back end team. I think like even if it's a full stack small team or a single dev, it is nice to have a spec. It sort of keeps you honest. And so that was the start of the whole discussion in the newsletter. But then it ultimately led to, okay, hopefully I've convinced you. Now, how do I get started? And where most developers like to go is, well, let's use code to do it, right? Like that's what we do. And I personally have never had success with that approach
Mm.
outside of like demos and a proof of concept, or maybe like breaking ground on something to get started. But the code first approach has been problematic for me. And so that was where my experience was coming from. And I was trying to share that, like, it's not that complicated to like just write the file yourself. And I think there's actually some benefits to it.
Yeah. I mean, so many developers are running about like everyone has to learn Kubernetes and everyone has to learn these 25 different things. Comically, most of those do end up being slightly overloaded YAML DSLs. But the idea of learning this one other YAML DSL is completely
Yeah.
unacceptable to anyone and will never do it. And that's pretty funny. So just in case there are people who haven't heard me banging on
Mm.
about OpenAPI in the past, Joel says spec, he means API specification, which is one other term for like API description or API design document. There's a million different names for this stuff, but yeah, basically it's like
Yeah.
I'm gonna describe the endpoints and properties and parameters and request bodies and all the bits of the interface of the API with some sort of machine language, which various tools can use, generally for docs, pretty handy for mocks and loads of other stuff. And I've built a spectral API scanner. So literally you put your open API in and it goes, oh, that's going to get you hacked, buddy. Watch out for that. There's a million things you can do with an API spec when you've got it. But Yeah, when left to the
True.
developers, picking up on what you said a minute ago, like if you leave it to the developers, they're just going to write a whole bunch of code. And if you ask them for documentation, they'll go and write down like 10 lines somewhere and it'll be bad. So at some point over the last, I don't know, over the last 5 years specifically, I feel like OpenAPI has picked up in popularity massively. And that's partly because people like me bang on about it all the time, but it's bloody useful for everyone to know what's going on. And you've got that machine learnable format. So and you've got this spec where you can generate some docs and you can use it for contract testing and a million things and that helps keep those docs up to date. But
Yes.
some folks don't like to
Yeah.
write that YAML out by hand because that is pretty boring. And there's a bunch of other ways of doing it. There was GUIs and things, but people don't like to write that by hand. And instead they try a bunch of creative ways to avoid having to write that. You were talking about in Laravel, there's a
Sure.
few kind of Laravel specific tools. How do people do it in Laravel? How do they get their code spitting out OpenAPI so they don't have to write it?
Yeah, it's what you might expect if even if you're not in Laravel, where there's some element of static analysis, and then that can be enhanced with some sort of annotations or like inline documentation to enhance it further or to specify like examples of things.
Mm,
Um, and I probably should say, like, I've at least not super recently, I've never actually tried to use one of those packages in earnest. Like, I will try somebody will recommend one, and I'll be like, "Oh, I'll give it a shot." And I usually get a couple days into it. I'm like, "I know. This is it's just it ends up you're just conforming to a different layer of abstraction
mm.
in the same sort of specification." And so it's really a personal thing. Like, I'm sure there are teams out there that do this and it works great. And I'm sure there are use cases where it's beneficial, but I'm generally not working on massive projects. Like maybe there's 50 to 100 API endpoints. And a lot of
That's pretty
times there might
big.
not even be a public consumer. Is it?
I think my
Okay. I mean,
API's
it's
got
not
like
Stripe.
5 right now, but yeah, fair enough.
Okay. Well, I'm counting like Git versus Post too, right?
Okay,
So,
sure.
in terms of
8.
resources, it's probably a lower number. But yeah, it's not I don't work on teams of like 50 developers and
Mm.
so there's probably some efficiencies that become more important and beneficial where the trade-offs might skew the other direction toward code first tooling. I just am not there. And
Mm.
here's maybe this is a question for you, Phil. Are there any tools that you've seen that do spec generation that actually leverage the spec, like things like refs and things like that, or does it end up spitting out some really flat, verbose document that no human would ever write in that way?
Yeah, that's the problem. Most of those tools will just kind of just vomit something upwards, which is not
Right.
particularly helpful. I mean, it generally it that sort of stuff doesn't really matter if you're just putting it straight into a documentation tool because the documentation tools will flatten it. So yeah,
Right.
the way that it seems to me is somebody has said, "Hey, we've started using OpenAPI to have one kind of documentation hub, a developer portal, whatever. We've got this thing,
Mhm.
and we need all the teams to make OpenAPI, and we don't care how you do it." I've been that guy. I've done that, and I'm like, some of them are like, "Oh, we've got it all in Postman, so we'll convert it into OpenAPI." I'm like, "Sure, whatever." And some of them are like, "Oh, we've got OpenAPI 2 or RAML or these different old kind of defunct formats," and I'm like, whatever, I can convert that
Yeah.
for you. And then eventually you end up with Open API and everyone's like, great, some of it's weird and some of it's ugly and some of it's not entirely right. But that's a step one is we now have one documentation hub for the entire thing. Great. But then over time, it's a case of like, well, how do we get this to be more useful? And how do we use this for more verticals as well? Like if you are just shoving it into docs, then it kind of makes that nice Stripe like 3 col API stuff that everyone wants. But if you
Yeah.
try and use it for code generation and a bunch of other use cases, it kind of falls apart and it gets a bit hard to like add stuff to it as well. So the one thing I've seen which helps, if you've got an API spec that's being kind of just a magic appeared out of your API, one thing that can be pretty handy. Have you heard of Open API overlays?
Mm-mm, no.
It's this like extension thing. So OpenAPI has started doing like working groups or special interest groups. And these special interest groups create different things. So they're doing like workflows, so you can document entire kind of workflows of API calls and things like that. And one of them is overlays, where you can basically, it's kind of like a spectral rule set if you're familiar. You kind of have like a JSON path and you're like, go to this bit of the document and then like add this or remove this. And so you can theoretically have
Okay.
some horrendously vommed out open API and then be like, and I'm going to add some descriptions in here, which are like 10 paragraphs long and have a bunch of markdown. So you can have your technical writers
Got
kind
it.
of wedging that stuff in. And so my initial, like, no one should ever do code first ever because then you have this useless thing, is somewhat kind of abated a bit, where it's like,
Mm,
okay, you've given us this useless thing and now some technical writers can jump through some quite horrendous hoops to make it a bit less useless, but that still isn't
yeah.
like the most shining endorsement for it.
Well, like you mentioned, if the only people reading the spec are doing so via like a generated HTML portal, then it doesn't probably matter internally if it's using like refs for shared schemas and things like that. But
Mm,
just like I'm thinking and recommending you write it by hand at least once, at least know how to do it. I also think that I like to look at the spec by hand too. Like the tooling is great to auto generate fancy, nice branded documentation. But I do find some value looking at the spec directly, and then especially seeing, oh, this specific type of request or this form payload is used more than one place. Like that tells me something about the
yeah.
overall API design that you don't see if it's just all flattened out.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's a useful thing. So kind of having intent written somewhere else outside of the code not only helps you spot
Yeah.
obvious mistakes from a wider pool of people that don't necessarily know how Laravel works, but it
Yeah.
just it becomes a lot more useful. Like, you can have a bunch of people doing design reviews that literally don't know Laravel and don't know its random conventions, and it also means that if
Hmm.
you accidentally have a slip of the keyboard and change some code, but you didn't necessarily change all of the annotations that came with it, then I think the graphic I used on a blog post talking about this was like a drinks cabinet with a label that says milk and it's clearly orange juice. Like, people kind of confuse the like proximity with
Right.
accuracy of like, these annotations are somewhat near the code I'm describing, so I'm sure someone will definitely remember to update them both. And so kind of having it in that second place means you can then kind of you have those extra checks where you use that open API as an
Yeah.
assertion in your contract test that says, does my code match what I think it does and what the design review team think it does and what everyone involved so
Right.
far has thought it would. And so that for me is kind of why I'm a big fan of the approach. But it's just really hard to get API developers to do another thing. They're like, I'm a coder, I write code.
Yes.
I would like to write some code for this.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a weird one.
One of the benefits I think there is in writing the spec separate from the code is like you could, especially if you start with the spec, is it forces you to think through the requirements in a level of detail that you don't often do. If you're getting a requirement from some stakeholder and they're like, "Hey, I want an endpoint to do this, this, and that." Okay, well, like who can do that? How
Mm,
long can that field be? Like, there's all these constraints that somebody has to make a decision on, and like that spec becomes the forcing function to decide, like, well, what is the maximum length, what is the format on this date time, or just things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that otherwise you might get to later in the middle of implementation, and a dev just like, oh, I guess we'll just do it this way, and it wasn't actually discussed or decided on.
Right. That's a really good point. That's, I think, where I was heading, was that like the API spec being thought of as a documentation mechanism is kind of the problem here, because it's basically, it's not always a problem. There are use cases where you have an API and you need to like play catch up, right? There's
Yeah.
API design first, there's API code first, and I've done polls where it's like, are you using API code first, API design first, switching from one to the other, or some awkward combination? And every time I do this, every couple of years, the answer is always like 25% of each. So there are some teams who are doing code first,
Yep.
some are doing design first, and it's just all over the place. But yes, like those tools that can help you kind of grab a whole bunch of metadata out of your code through static analysis, and maybe you add a few other things in there, can really help you get a head start. And then you have the open API that you can go back and put assertions into your code base to make sure that it's correct. And then you can expand that. And if you want to add a new endpoint, then you can design first on that open API file. You can add a new endpoint that's completely imaginary, start working on it, have everyone agree whether that's a good idea or not, whether it solves the needs or not, run it through a mock generator, a mock server, so that people can interact with it before it even exists. And then later on, kind of code it and make sure that it matches the contract test for that. But do you think that's how everyone should work?
I like your use case because I do join a lot of, I'll call them legacy projects, where you don't have documentation. In fact, I hate to say this, sometimes you don't have tests, right? Like, and so that I could see as a useful time to generate something just to get a starting point, and then edit it from there, and then like, write contract tests around the little bits as you go. And so I got to remember that, because a lot of times when I join a project, like decisions have already been made and now you're just trying to catch up. And I think code generation could be an excellent use case for that, just to get you to where you want to go faster and to not have to write all of that by hand and reverse engineer it, like try to figure out, well, what are all the overlapping validation rules or schema constraints in the database layer or things like that. Static analysis can get you 80% there.
For sure. I think an interesting third way I've come across, and we've written about it a bit on the blog, is kind of using HTTP traffic inspection, right? So I've definitely inherited APIs where no one knows how the heck this works. You've got to like decompile the iPhone app, and there's some third-party client that you can't even look at the code of, and like no one can get into the compiled Java app on some bloody API that people haven't got the password for anymore. It sounds silly, but I've been in these silly situations. I help out a lot of struggling startups, and everyone's like, right, we've got to rebuild this API. And you're like, what API? If I can't find any of the endpoints, like everyone check your browser history. What are we doing here? And so being able to kind of wrap it in a traffic proxy that essentially says like all the requests going in, or you can wedge them into the browser and then kind of run around clicking things. There's a bunch of these different tools for sniffing actual traffic going through the system. And then you can kind of take all of that and output an open API file and say, there you go. And I feel like if we're talking kind of the catching up with design first, then I generally feel more interested in going with the traffic sniffing approach because it's real. Like you can still look at some stuff and get it wrong. Like if when you've got these complicated dynamic payloads where there's this or this or this that could come through, and you're like, it's definitely only this because you've only seen it come. You haven't noticed any null values in there, so you said it's a required property. Mistakes like that can be made depending on how much the sample size goes through. But I feel like the promise of having these kind of framework integrated static analysis tools is potentially misleading unless they can hook into enough where you literally don't need to add other stuff yourself. Because as soon as you ask the humans to get involved, that's when they're just introducing human error. Have you come across anything like that?
Not directly, because again, I've not worked on a project recently that has done the automated tooling, but I've experienced drift for sure. And honestly, that's one of my fears with code generation. You alluded to it earlier, is like if you make an unintentional change, well, and it just regenerates the spec to match it. Now your tests are still passing, but unless a human catches that in code review or design review of some sort, like you could unintentionally change your API even in a breaking way, which to me is like the worst possible outcome of an API change. So I don't know if there's solutions to that, but yeah, either the intentional or unintentional drift is just an ongoing problem I have experienced. With that traffic inspection, like that's super useful for like sort of those black box scenarios you were describing. Like I'm going to have nightmares about that. But I'm almost wondering too, if like that in conjunction, like when I'm joining a project, like I'm coming into some project, if I just use static analysis, that doesn't tell me how much dead code is in there. Right. And like now maybe I'm wasting a week of work trying to document and test something. And then I ship it to the client. They're like, oh, we haven't used that in 5 years. Like that. Well, that was just a wasted week of effort. So I could see pairing the static analysis with the traffic analysis just to like, even to prioritize, these are the paths that get the most traffic. Like, let's focus on those. These endpoints, they never got traffic. Oh, I'll ask the client even before I start working on it. Oh, yeah, we can just delete that. Right. Like, so I could see a hybrid approach there being, being useful. useful too.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I've seen a few frameworks that are making me love the idea of code first a little bit more. I wrote an article recently, and I can't remember
Okay.
the names of any of these things. I think it's like Hummer in Node and Fast API. I'll get some proper links in the show notes when I remember. But there's this kind of new idea of like open API aware frameworks, right? Like built into the core of the framework is in the past you've got like Swagger PHP, which I hated. Like when I first got involved with Swagger, when I first started trying to figure out how to document an API, I looked at Swagger PHP and went, for all the reasons we've discussed. It's literally you put a bunch of doc block
Yeah.
annotations in your code and hope that it's correct. And I ran away, and then I ended up doing other things. But that's still like the main premise. But with modern tools like Scribe is a really cool tool, and like props to the people that have made this. But they've essentially got rid of quite a few of the annotations because the framework is kind of saying that this is a post or a get, and like they know what the URL is from looking at the code. They're doing a lot of that static analysis, but it's still kind of
Yeah.
into the framework a bit, and there's still a certain amount of duplication. And so what I like about the frameworks that are coming at this from like the framework itself will tell you what your open API is, because just by using the framework, we are building up all of the bits that you need. That seems really cool. Like when you write the validation rules for your models, they all line up with an appropriate validation in OpenAPI. So
Yeah.
when you're doing that, it sounds that to me seems like it would be pretty much just fine, because the the main thing of like API design first is it's more about planning. You should like plan this thing and spend a lot more time in the planning stage, past the whiteboard, but before you start writing loads of code. But if the framework can make
Okay.
itself simple enough that the framework is just like a config DSL, where you are, instead of writing OpenAPI in YAML, you're writing OpenAPI in this kind of a bit of PHP code, and it's easy enough to read and it makes sense. And then you just shove a bit of business logic in there later. That to me would be fine. That kind of absolves the differences, removes the differences between OpenAPI, well, between design first and code first. It kind of makes them become the same thing. You just kind of like add your business logic some other time. But none of the tools in Laravel that I've seen are that. And it's quite rare to actually find them. And at this point, I worry that those projects are kind of just like hobby projects and not a whole thing. So there's a bit of hope in
Mm.
there, but I don't think anyone's taking the idea too seriously at this point.
Yeah, the reason this came on my radar recently is there is a newer package, like it's not even at 1.0 in Laravel called Scramble. I don't
Mm,
know if you've seen this one. It will look at like in Laravel, you have a form request with validation rules. It will statically analyze those rules and set like max lengths or field types or things like that, purely
mm,
based on that with like zero annotation, which is I do like the promise of it. I really do. Like I get the appeal. Um, one one other thing too I was thinking about is when you mentioned whiteboards and upfront design, like I cringed a little bit because like I've come over the years to recognize like you never can plan super far in advance.
right.
And but so one thing I wanted to clarify is like even with the design first approach, I generally do it like literally endpoint by endpoint, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
design it, I write the spec, we agree on it, I implement it, then we repeat for the next one. Not like, well, let's design the entire API and see what happens because that
yeah, yeah,
that just never
for
materializes
sure.
correctly.
Man, yeah, it's something that I need to do a whole episode on this, on like how do you actually plan an API? Because the stuff I said in my book was pretty immature at the time. I think I was like, just think of all the endpoints you need, and then like put post and get next to them or whatever is a bit dumb. But like the phases
Yeah.
of planning, and there's like literally
Mhm.
stakeholder interviews, which is like a concept from user research and UX, and
Yeah.
then kind of taking everyone's needs and requirements, and not necessarily too literally, but distilling down the essence of what they want and what they need, and how multiple different stakeholders can ask for different things, but finding the middle ground that will be just fine for everyone. Like doing all this really complicated work. And then another group of people, or you with a different hat on, can then start to say, well, then these are the endpoints that I need. But even then, like, is jumping straight into endpoints premature? Like, do do you need to think a little bit more about kind of the workflows and the type of API that could be used, and like, should this even be a endpoint based API, or should it be event driven? There's so many stages to the planning, and it's hard to figure out where you should start. An open API and design the spec first stuff, like, it doesn't help you with any of that. Like, you literally, your planning starts with Slack calls and whiteboards and like Miro boards and sequence flow diagrams and like chatting to a load of people and having a spreadsheet of feedback and all this crazy stuff that no one that I know is really working on, apart from the tools that I've mentioned, but they're like generic. And then once someone has said, you definitely need to make a HTTP API and it should probably do these things, that's when it's time to get the open API out, because you're literally turning the words they've just said right there of like, make an API that does this, this, and this. Then you kind of are going, well, okay, we'll have that endpoint, and that endpoint. And where design first gets really handy there is you can say, okay, I'm going to turn those words into like, I'm going to reshape them into a little bit of YAML, and I'm going to like, the API will look like this. Then it's much easier to change that little bit of YAML than it is to go and change a whole pile of Laravel code. You're like, oh God, now I've got to rename all of my controllers, and that means I've got to rename all my models, and all the relationships are going to be broken. And that's really daft.
Yep.
And so pretending that code first is quicker because you just add some annotations to some code that you wrote is predicated on the fact that you wrote exactly the right code first time. And when does that happen?
It doesn't, right? Exactly. At least not for anything non-trivial.
Yeah. Well, all right. Pretty decent agreement on that. Screw that.
Awesome.
That was easy.
See, we're far too reasonable, Phil. In our older age and maturity, we're mellowing, and we're just seeing things much more reasonably.
Absolutely. I haven't had a fight about framework interoperability in a long time. Well, fantastic. Let's call that. Okay. Where can people find more of you? You're all over the internet doing all sorts of things. What are you up to?
Yeah, my main hub of activity now is Mastering Laravel.io. On there we have a podcast for Laravel and PHP devs, the mailing list, some books and courses if you want to like keep me fed, like, all that good stuff. But that's really the central point for all of it.
Nice. I need to get on that newsletter, because I am using Laravel more and more, and they've gone on like a rampage of major versions, and I'm like, I remember thinking 4 and 5 were quite nice, and now version 11's out. I'm like, I don't know what's happening. Brilliant.
Yeah, it does tend to move quickly.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. And pleasure having you on the show.
Yep. Talk to you later.